Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 2. First Day of the Rest of My Life. Waking up to the blaring of an alarm clock 2 hours earlier than usual, after a night of sleeping far worse than usual, was not what Izuku would call an ideal way to start the day. But then again, Izuku wouldn't describe any part of his life as ideal. So he figured this is par for the course on the first day of his new life. The realization of why his alarm clock was going off 2 hours early hit him like a freight train. For a moment he lay there frozen, his body propped up on an elbow with the other arm reaching to silence the offending noise. He stared blankly at the clock, not realizing the numbers changing, too out of touch to realize how much the noise was grating on his ears until it turned off on its own after 10 minutes. The abrupt silence brought him back to reality, and he forced himself to look away and breathe. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he allowed himself a moment to gather his hazy thoughts. He was on a time crunch. He could have a crisis later. Forcing himself to stand, he grabbed his phone and set another alarm for half an hour, and cranked the shower to its highest temperature and spent as much time as he could basking in the near scalding hot cascade of water. This was a luxury he's not sure he will be afforded again for quite some time. He scrubbed every inch of his skin as if he could stock up on cleanliness for all the showers he was sure he would miss in the future. Once the second alarm of the day went off, he wasted no more time packing up his shampoo and all the bars of soap he could find in the house, mournfully deciding the conditioner was unnecessary and would take up too much space. He packed his toothbrush and toothpaste after he brushed his teeth and looked dejectedly between his bedding and the space he had left in the suitcase. That was not all going to fit. Figuring the blanket was the most important, he folded it long ways twice, then rolled it up as compactly as he could, and after some not-so-gentle persuasion, it made its way into the suitcase with his clothes and toiletries. Having packed everything else he could last night, he surveyed the apartment one last time, the place he grew up in, his home. No. Breakdown later. Violently shoving his motions down, Izuku continued his final sweep of the place clinically. Once satisfied that he balanced his space to useful objects ratio, he slung his backpack across his shoulders, placed his duffel on top of his suitcase, and threaded their handles together. He placed his key on the table, put his shoes on, and did not let himself look anywhere but directly in front of himself until the apartment was well out of sight. Strolling down the streets, his feet took him down the familiar path to the southeast, to the slums of Mustafa. As he walked, he went through his list of potential hiding spaces. There was that weird crook in the alleyway behind the mini-mart, but people were always fishing through the dumpster nearby. Too risky. There was the abandoned warehouse on Block 12, or the one on Block 8, or Block 5. There wasn't a shortage of derelict and abandoned real estate on that side of town. Izuku figured this area must have been busy in its day, but people go where the money is, and the money surely wasn't here anymore. The warehouses could be a longer-term solution to Izuku's housing situation, but as of now, he didn't have much data on the foot traffic in the area, and the unknown was unsafe. Come on, where's somewhere no one would disturb? He murmured to himself as he walked. A few years ago, he might have said the trash, but he knew, or knew of, too many people who relied on dumpster diving to get by. Something less interesting than a dumpster. That's it, the dump. A place full of trash that's already been sitting too long to house anything even moderately edible. Not a real dump, of course. Trash there was getting moved around and compacted every day. It was monitored, and that wouldn't work. But illegal dumping grounds obviously weren't monitored, and Izuku knew just the one, Dagobah Beach, the biggest and stinkiest dump in the city. It had something to do with the tides and the shape of the land that constantly had trash from along the whole coast washing up on shore. The trash would ensnare fish and other poor sea critters and beach them daily. The constant state of disarray the beach was in was the perfect cover for people to dump things, and eventually the city stopped trying to keep up. The mixture of rotting fish and freshly dumped trash produced an aroma that no one messed with. It was perfect. Setting his course, Izuku made his way to the beach. So much for that shower lasting. The beach was just as lovely as he remembered it, which was to say, not at all. Doing his best to touch things as little as possible, Izuku tiptoed his way through the mountains of trash, the ones further from the water as they were less likely to get jostled by the tides changing. Eventually he came across a refrigerator sticking out of the sand at an odd angle. The lower fridge portion was too buried in sand to open, but the freezer was at eye level. Izuku very much did not want to open the freezer. On the one hand, it could be relatively clean, and the seal would keep the smell of the beach from seeping into his clothes and blankets. Or, far more likely, given Izuku's luck, he would break the seal and his nostrils would be met with a condensed biome of rot that had been growing diseases not yet known to the human race. Steeling his nerves, Izuku pulled his shirt collar over his nose and whipped open the door, simultaneously taking several steps back. Looking up, he was delighted to find that the freezer only had a few items of packaged food, of which the seals had not been broken. He removed them carefully, shoved his suitcase in and closed the door. It didn't fit the duffel bag, but he was less worried about the stench lingering on plastic figurines and paper posters. As long as he could find somewhere that they would stay dry, that would be fine. Looking around, he decided it would be best to just rest it under a half-broken plastic tub nearby. There wasn't rain in the forecast for at least another week, and it was all well out of the range of the tide. He stood and brushed the sand off his clothes as he made his way out of the maze of trash, taking note of the path he took so that he could find his way back later. Once back on solid pavement and away from the oppressive miasma that the beach exuded, he checked the time on his phone. 7:30. He'd better get a move on if he was going to make it to school with enough time to hide away from his classmates. He was cutting it close. It might be better to wait and not risk giving up one of his hiding spots, because too many students had already shown up. Sighing, he accepted that he used up his luck for the day finding that freezer, and he took his sweet time walking to the hellhole of a school called Aldera Junior High. Unable to arrive early and hide himself away, Izuku was now left with two options. Option 1 was to wait just outside of the school bounds until most of the students made their way to class and hope he could dodge the few students lingering in the halls. However, this, of course, ran the risk of getting held up by people who wouldn't get in nearly as much trouble for being late. This wasn't ideal because they could drag him off to who knows where and do who knows what without a teacher stepping in when it went too far. High risk, but this option held the tantalizing potential of everyone leaving him alone. Option 2. He could go to class now and be forced to sit in a room full of people who seemed to live only to torment him for the minutes that stretched into eternities before the bell rang and the teacher was forced to stop pretending he didn't notice anything in order to start class. This option pretty much guaranteed someone would mess with him, but the likelihood of it getting physical was severely diminished with a teacher being present. Option 1 had a good chance of working. Izuku had become quite fast and slippery over the years, but on the off chance it didn't work, Izuku would surely end up in detention after school, and that was something he couldn't afford. He needed to scope out potential shelters before it got too dark, and he couldn't do that if he was stuck here. Groaning, Izuku made his way to class, resigning himself to death threats and name-calling that had long since lost any real sting. Surprisingly, Izuku made it to his seat without fanfare. There were a few sneers and a foot stuck out in the aisle that he had to dodge, but he made it to his chair in one piece without being told to off himself, so he counted it as a success. Of course, that didn't last once Kacchan and Nagaglo's cronies strolled into the room. Izuku heard them coming from down the hall and let a mask of indifference fall over his face as they rounded the corner through the doorway. Tsubasa-kun zeroed in on him immediately. "Hey, Deku, you're here early. Would your parents finally get sick of you and kick you out?" Mask failing him, Izuku couldn't help but laugh at the irony. His parents didn't kick him out. No, he drove them away. Quickly remembering himself, he clacked his jaw shut and looked down at his desk. But the damage was done. Izuku had laughed at them. Kami can't save him now. He knew his luck had run up with that freezer. "What's so funny, Deku? You think your mom's too nice to get sick of a worthless null like you?" Kacchan scoffed. Izuku kept his eyes glued to his desk. "You know, she only keeps you around because your dad had the good sense to dip first," he continued as the other kids laughed. The desk started to blur, and at this point, Izuku wasn't sure if it was because he was tearing up or dissociating. Having pushed his complete mental breakdown off for this long, it could be either, but he was compelled to think it was the latter when he looked up and realized nearly a whole hour had passed. At least Kacchan was leaving him alone. Not much fun to taunt someone who's not there. The rest of the day passed in a blur of which Izuku was only partially aware of. His mind kept making plans on where to search for shelter first. What to do if X, Y, or Z went wrong, and worrying if his stash had been found, or rendered inaccessible by another mound of trash burying it. Kami, he's such an idiot. He should have checked the structural integrity of the surrounding trash heaps. He was just so focused on getting out of the noxious smell before it cemented itself into his clothes and hair. He should run back as quickly as he can after school lets out. Or, wait, no. What if someone follows him? He should wait until he's found somewhere to bring it all, right? But what if the place he finds is compromised? He should stake out the area for a while to make sure it's safe. Better to keep his things spread out so he doesn't lose everything all at once if things go south. So he's going to really be roughing it for a few days. That's probably the safest option. Better to do that now when the nights didn't get too cold than find himself out on his ass with nothing to his name in the middle of autumn. He was so lost in his thoughts that he failed to realize the day was over until the bell rang and pulled him forcefully back to the present. Swiftly stuffing all his things into his bag, he bolted out the door before he ran into any more hell to pay for laughing at Katsuki and his extras earlier. Izuku proceeded in his normal route, much more nervous than usual with his laptop in his backpack. He felt like he had a neon sign on him that said, "Mug me! Mug me!" It was stupid, he knew how to stay out of trouble here. In the daylight, at least, he could settle himself into the tight embrace of paranoia when the sun set. Right now, he had an objective. He headed straight for the warehouse on Block 8. It was closest to school and the beach, which was ideal, so unless something immediately set off alarm bells, he would spend his first night there, keeping an eye out for potential trouble in the future. Block 8 set off several alarm bells. It looks like the local gang either shifted or expanded because out of the handful of people he saw, he knew half of them to be gang members. Keeping his head down, he changed course towards Block 12. It felt like he'd gone through the same process a million times before he found a suitably abandoned warehouse on Block 15. Block 12 had no one around, but too many footprints for Izuku's liking, and Block 5 was already occupied with several sleeping bags and blanket nests visible from some of the windows, and on and on. This warehouse was definitely abandoned, and for good reason. It looked ready to fall if a light breeze hit it wrong. Izuku figured that there were worse ways to go than getting crushed in his sleep, and the sun was setting, so his choice was made for him. Stepping carefully, he found a corner that looked pretty sturdy and took out the pitiful notes he'd taken earlier, drudging through the homework as best he could. Once the sun had dipped past the horizon, he gave up on trying to see, not wanting to waste his phone battery for light. Packing his things away, far more neatly this time, he zipped his bag up and secured it to his front. Curling his limbs around it protectively, he laid down, using one arm as a pillow, and closed his eyes, not expecting to fall asleep, but hoping at least to rest for a while.